Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Doctrine Dialogues. I'm your host, Paul Bollinger, and today I would like to speak to you about the question of slavery in the Bible. This question was posed to me by my friend Caleb, and he just wanted me to explore the issue of slavery in the Bible because it is pretty off-putting that God flat out describes how to handle slavery. And that is kind of odd that God would say, I am all perfect and all good and this holy, benevolent being, and here's how you have slaves. But I think when you look at the details, the devil's in the details, and in this case, the details actually seem to make this seem basically not as bad as it sounds from the start. At the beginning, I just want to point out that slavery in the Bible does not come anywhere close to slavery in early America. All right, America enslaved Africans, and it was horrible. It was atrocious. It was sin. Americans, we treated Africans like cattle, even worse than cattle, and completely like property. Just work them to death basically, and that was evil. What we have here in the Bible, it is called slavery. It is not like the slavery in early American history. And so throughout this talk, I'm going to try and make as many comparisons as possible about how it was different, comparisons and contrasts between early American slavery and biblical slavery. So the first difference is that Hebrews are not to enslave their own brothers permanently. So if you are a Hebrew living in the nation of Israel, you can sell yourself as a slave, and you can sell yourself for up to 6 years, and then in the 7th year, you will be set free. You will get your freedom for nothing. So you don't have to buy your freedom. You're selling yourself for 6 years, and then you go free after 7 years. That's a big difference to American slavery, where they were slaves for life. All right? There's a lot more about slaves. We can get into that later. But I just want to point out that even in the Old Testament, we've got 3 major chapters in the Old Testament that deal with slavery: Exodus 21, Leviticus 25, and Deuteronomy 15. Even in the Old Testament, in Exodus 21, it flat out tells us that slavery that the Americans did to Africans was wrong and evil. Because in Exodus 21:16 it says, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death." It was the death penalty to kidnap someone and force them into slavery. And that's what Americans and Europeans through the slave trade and all that stuff, that's what we did to Africans. And God says that's worthy of death. All right? So again, that is another way in which biblical slavery is different from African slavery. Biblical slavery, generally the Hebrew slaves would sell themselves into slavery to pay off a debt. In unbiblical, evil slavery, it is kidnapping people and forcing them into slavery for the rest of their life. Down here in Exodus 21, verse 20, says, "When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged." All right, so here it says that if a man hits one of his slaves and he intentionally kills them, you are to kill the man who killed the slave. He shall be avenged. That means you kill the man that killed his slave. So you see, here the Bible shows slaves, they're not property. They're human beings, and their lives have value. And if you intentionally kill them, you are to be put to death because you just committed murder. Yes, that was your slave. Yes, it's a human being. Yes, you just murdered them. The next verse, verse 21, says, "But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money." What this verse is saying It's saying that if the slave survived a day or two and then died, it's saying that clearly the master did not intend to kill the slave. He intended to punish the slave with, beatings or whatever, which is another issue we can get into. But the master did not intentionally kill his slave. He wanted the slave to live. He was trying to teach him a lesson, went a little too far, and the slave died by accident. And what it's saying here, for the slave is his money, what that means is that the master is receiving his own punishment. He didn't intend to kill the slave, but the slave did die. And in this situation, the master did not intentionally murder his slave. And basically, you reap what you sow. You beat your slave died, now you lost money. Your slave could have earned you a lot more money, but now you lost that opportunity. So God is saying you don't have to punish the guy because he's already lost. He's already under punishment. He's already suffered. He's reaped what he sowed. Down here in Exodus 21:26 it says, "When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye." Here we see that permanent injury to a slave, permanent physical injury to a slave, is not allowed. And compensation for that, normally there would be a financial compensation or something like that. In this case, the financial compensation goes directly to the debt of the slave, and that slave is allowed his freedom. In addition, it says, if he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. All right? So here, we see that unlike slavery in early America, where you could beat your slaves and maim them and permanently injure them, and there would be no repercussions for you as a slave owner or slave master, here in the Bible, you have to treat your slaves pretty good. You can't intentionally kill them. You can't permanently injure them, or they will go free. And this I just want to point out that slaves have rights in the Bible. And in basically what you see, the more you read biblical slavery, the more you realize that it is the ancient form of bankruptcy. And so nowadays, if you get into debt and you can't pay your debts, you file bankruptcy and your debts end up getting canceled. In the ancient world, if you had a debt you couldn't pay, typically what you would do is you would go to the person who you owed a debt to, or you could even go to someone else, but you go to the person that you owe a debt to, and you say, hey, I can't pay this debt, but I'll work for you for the next 6 years. And they would say, okay, and that's how you paid off your debts that you couldn't pay. So biblical slavery is basically the modern form of bankruptcy in a sense. Today we deal with the situation of someone not being able to pay their debts with bankruptcy. Back then, you would sell yourself into slavery, and it was really more of an indentured servitude because you weren't going to be a slave forever. All right, you would get out. So we'll move on to the Leviticus 25. If your brother becomes poor besides you and sells himself to you, so if a Hebrew sells himself to another Hebrew, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner. What did I tell you? This slavery in the Bible is more like indentured servitude than it is actual slavery, indefinite slavery. He will serve with you till the year of Jubilee, which is basically a 7-year rotation. He'll go out from you free. And then God says, you are to free the Hebrews. You're not supposed to keep them as slaves forever, for they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over them ruthlessly. So God himself says, when you purchase Hebrews as slaves, you don't treat them like cattle, but you shall fear your God. We'll move on to this bottom verse, then we'll come back to this. It says, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly. So you're supposed to treat Israelites that are sold into slavery to other Israelites. You're supposed to treat them as a human being. Down here, I just want to point out, it says, redeeming a poor man. If a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother, so a Hebrew, besides him, becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, to become a member of the stranger's clan. So basically, you have this situation where a Hebrew becomes poor and he has debts that he can't pay. And let's say he's indebted to his friend, and he goes to his friend, another Hebrew, and he says, "Hey, look, Joseph, I can't pay that debt I owe to you. Can I sell myself to you as a slave?" And Joseph says, "Well, hey, man, I'd love to help you out. I'd love to buy you as a slave to get you out of this debt that you owe me, but I don't have enough money to buy you as a slave. So find someone else that has money that you can, sell yourself to as a slave. Get the money from that guy, give it to me to pay off your debt. Work for the other guy for 6 or 7 years, and then you'll be free from all your debts." But I just want to point out here that this Hebrew, when he sells himself to a non-Hebrew in his own land, it's pointed out that if he, the Hebrew who sold himself into slavery, grows rich, he may redeem himself. In other words, slaves, Hebrew slaves in the Bible, had their own bank accounts. All right? And this points out, too, when you're selling yourself into slavery, that doesn't mean you don't have any of your own property. I mean, it could. It could mean that you are literally so poor you don't have a house, you don't have, any of your own livestock or anything. But it could also mean that, you do have a house, you do have some livestock, you just don't have, the right money, or however it works out, you don't have the money that you need to pay off your debts. And so you could have your own property, have your own bank account, sell yourself into slavery to make some money, and to pay off your debt. In other words, a major difference between Hebrew slavery and modern employment is that in Hebrew slavery, you were stuck with your slave owner, with your boss, for the next, 6 years at the most. In modern employment situations, you can quit your job and move to a new job anytime you want. So that's a major difference between, slavery in the ancient world and employment today. I do want to point out in Leviticus 25, verses 44 through 46 say that you can make slaves out of the nations that are around you. So if you buy a slave from a non-Hebrew, like a non-Hebrew person, you buy an Egyptian slave or something, you can keep them to inherit. You can keep them as a possession forever. You can give them to your sons as a possession, so they be inheritance. So basically, you can make slaves indefinitely of people if they're not Hebrews. Now, you still have to treat them like human beings. These same laws about slaves, you still have to treat them like human beings. They're not cattle. But the difference between Hebrew slaves and Egyptian slaves, or any other slaves from another nation, is that you could keep slaves from another nation forever. Okay? Then let's see here. Deuteronomy 15 is another Old Testament chapter. Says, "If your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you." We've seen that before, but now look at this. "When you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your own threshing floor, out of your winepress, as the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him." In other words, when you set a slave free, you're supposed to give him enough property that he will be able to flourish, and that he won't have to sell himself into slavery again. In other words, this looks a lot more like a child leaving their father's household. This looks like a child growing up and moving out on their own, because they're parting with gifts and with money and with resources to be self-sufficient. Then it even says here, "If the slave that you're setting free says to you, 'I will not go out from you,' because he loves you and your household, since he is well off with you, then you shall take an awl," which is a pointed rod, basically, "and you shall put it through his ear into the door." So you'll pierce his ear, "and he shall be your slave forever, and to your female slaves you shall do the same. In other words, this shows a major difference between Hebrew slavery and American slavery. In Hebrew slavery, the slaves could love their masters so much that even though they had the chance to go free, they might decide that they wouldn't. On their own free will say, life as a slave under you as a master is not bad at all. I'm going to stay here forever. That's insane to me. That's a major difference from early American slavery. Then in verse 18 here it says, "It shall not seem hard to you when you let him go free from you, for at half the cost of a hired worker he has served you 6 years. So the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do." Here I want to point out, I've heard that in the Roman Empire, anywhere from 1 out of 5 to 1 out of 3 people was a slave. And again, slavery in the Roman Empire was very different. Slaves could be very well educated. They could be doctors. They could be a lot of highly intelligent, highly skilled workers, but it was just a matter of being in debt or something of that sort. Here it points out, at half the cost of a hired worker, he has served you 6 years. I just want to point out, slaves are paid. You sell yourself into slavery to someone else, and you sell yourself at a price, and they give that money to you. So it's like selling your labor for the next, few years. Now, it looks like that was, you're selling yourself for less money. But the whole point is that you're getting your debts paid off. And so, yeah, that's very different from American slavery. You didn't, sell like the slave traders sold Africans into slavery, but the Africans weren't selling themselves into slavery. They were being kidnapped, All right, and so that's the Old Testament on slavery. I hope you've noticed some marked differences between American slavery and ancient slavery, and I hope you start to see a parallel between our form of bankruptcy and their form of basically selling yourself into slavery. I want to jump ahead. We saw the one instance back in Exodus 21 where it says, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death." Kidnapping is, evil. I want to point out in 1 Timothy 1 verse 10, it puts enslavers in the same category as the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, liars, perjurers, whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. It puts them in the same category as those who strike their fathers and mothers, murderers, ungodly, sinners, lawless, disobedient. So here's just a list of bad people and bad things. And it puts enslavers in that list, and there's a note on it, and the footnote is that those who take someone captive in order to sell him into slavery. This is talking about the American form of slavery, where you kidnap someone and force them to be a slave against their will. All right. Then I just want to point out something that I looked up on Wikipedia, and this should be obvious, but just so that I have a source to quote, Wikipedia says slavery was a common practice in antiquity. So the ancient world, a lot of people practiced slavery. And I by no means think that it's a perfect solution to situations like bankruptcy. I think a better solution would obviously be people forgiving debts and people working together to help pay off someone's debts. But this isn't a perfect world. And I would point out that God is a patient God. Christianity is very much a religion where I want to think how to say this. We come as we are, but we don't stay as we are. We come to God as we are, all messed up, and God changes us over time. And a lot of times that change is pretty slow. And this is even seen in the Bible. In Exodus 20, this is the 10 Commandments. God is speaking out loud to the entire nation of Israel, and he commands the Israelites. And this is the most basics, of Judaism and Christianity, monotheism. There is one God. God says, "You shall have no other gods before me." He doesn't say there are no other gods. He says, "Look, I know you guys are worshiping a lot of gods. Just make sure that I'm the top dog. Worship me more than any of the other gods. Have no other gods before me." All right? And this goes on. This is seen in Deuteronomy 4. And Moses says, "To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord is God. There is no other God beside him. Out of heaven he let you hear his voice," talking about the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20, "that he might discipline you." So in Exodus 20, God says, "Look, I know you guys worship a lot of gods, but I'm the God that brought you out of the land of Egypt. Don't have any other gods before me. I'm the top dog." Moses says there are no other gods. And then in Joshua 24, so we're moving through time here, Joshua says, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel." And then even further down time, Isaiah 43, God says, "Before me no God was formed, nor shall there be any after me." I just want to point out the progression there. God doesn't start out, he's talking here on Mount Sinai, giving the Ten Commandments, and he doesn't start out by saying, what he does in Exodus 43:10. He doesn't say, "Hey, before me, there were no gods formed, nor shall there be after me. I'm the only God." He doesn't start out with that. He starts out by saying, "Look, I know you're worshiping a lot of gods. I know in Egypt they had a lot of gods, and I just brought you out of there. But look, I'm the top dog. Just worship me first and foremost." Then Moses goes on and says, "Look, there is no other God, man. I know you're worshiping all these other gods. They're all fake. The only God is the one of the Bible." And Joshua goes on to say, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you." And then in Isaiah 43:10, again, God just emphasizes there are no other gods. So I just want to point out the progression there and say that God has done that in my life. God took me as I was, steeped in sin, and he has changed my goals in life. My goals were to basically join the military, rise up in the ranks, and lead a coup on the American government. Why? Because it'd be fun, not because I thought I'd be successful, but hey, might as well try. God took me as that crazy, idea of a guy, and now I don't like war. I like peace. And so, just as God was patient with the Israelites and changed them over time, so also God was patient with me and has changed me over time and continues to change me over time. I guarantee that God is patient with you and changes you over time, and that's what we see in the Bible. Because in the ancient world, a lot of people practice slavery. It's not the perfect solution, but God took an imperfect practice and he made sure that people treated slaves better. He improved things to the point that enslavers are considered evil. And I believe that it is largely because of the Bible that slavery is not as widely practiced as it was in the ancient world. Hope you guys enjoyed that. Again, my name is Paul with the Doctrine Dialogues, and I am by no means infallible. I am not the Pope. I am simply here to start a conversation, and I hope that if I've said anything wrong, you will find it and you will tell me about it so that I can correct it. I hope that if you find something that I have not included in this, you will point it out so that I can include it. I hope that if you have more questions, you would bring them up so that I can talk about it. Faith is something that is made better by people coming together and talking with understanding about these things, not by pretending we know it all. Because frankly, it's a big book, and God's a big God. And to pretend you know everything, kind of seems arrogant. Anyways, thank you guys for listening. Hope to see you again. This is Paul with the Doctrine Dialogues. Have a good day.